Welcome to another episode of Federal Data Talk, the podcast where we dive deep into the rapidly changing world of data, especially in the public sector, with your host, me, Stephen Cole, an Azure DoD specialist at Microsoft Federal. Let's jump right in. But before we get started, got to satisfy the legal folks. Hit it.
The content provided in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The opinions expressed herein belong solely to the individual host or guest and do not represent those of any other person or entity. All rights reserved. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including recording, photocopying, or other electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical reviews and certain other non-commercial uses permitted by copyright law. For permission requests, DM the publisher on X, Federal Data Talk. The information in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice. Listeners should not act upon any information provided in this podcast without seeking professional counsel.
All right, hey, welcome. I'm your host, Stephen, and I'm excited to welcome our next guest. It's actually his first podcast episode, believe it or not, which it's shocking to me because of how popular. I was talking to a bunch of other folks that I work with, and they're like, "Oh, you want to talk about Azure Virtual Desktop? You want to talk about connectivity network? Okay, you need to talk to John Kelby or Kelbley." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, all right then. Well, if it's that definitive, let's go ahead and do it." So, John, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing super duper.
Fantastic.
Super excited today. It's April. It was snowing here in Connecticut this morning.
Is that unusual?
We had flurries. Well, it's flurry. It's April, you know. What are you going to do?
Yeah, that kind of, okay. Right. That threw me off a little bit.
Yeah.
People were, well, it's 70 and it's, I'm in Dallas, so it's 70 degrees. So that's a little unusual too. Typically it's like approaching 100 or 90 at least.
Right.
So, well, I appreciate you blocking some time. Just real quick, before we jump into some of the topics, I mean, in Data Talk, essentially the premise of the show, informal discussions around PaaS, IaaS, cloud, on-prem, all of these terms that, quite frankly, are marketing buzzwords that a lot of people misuse and or potentially just try to obfuscate for a bunch of different reasons. Just wanted to create more opportunities for informal discussions around these topics so we can dive in. I'm interested in some of your background. So real quick, could you tell me a little bit about, what you've done, what kind of got you to this point?
Sure.
or what you're doing now? Yeah.
So I'm the Azure Advanced Migration Lead for public sector in corporate as part of the GBB org. So I'm here to help, being from corporate and all. But what my team does is we do interesting things around Azure, and I'm one of these corporate people, unusual corporate people with a CAC and a clearance. So I get to hang out with a lot of DoD and intelligence folks talking about stuff. But I've been with Microsoft 21 years doing infrastructure things. So less databasey, but providing storage infrastructure for on-premises deployments for SQL and that sort of stuff. I can't even spell SQL. It's tricky.
You and me both, my friend. It's like,
yeah. So I'm not a database person. My wife's a DBA type, but I'm not. So I do the disks and I give you your IOPS and your networking, and that's what I do. But been doing a lot of Azure stuff the last, say, I don't know, eight or so years. So
in that 8 years, in that 8 years, let's talk real quick. So actually, before we jump into that, I was told to ask you about Nutter Butters. Is there a story there? Are Nutter Butters?
Yeah, some of the Air Force team says my call sign's Nutter Butter. We, let's say the Marriott Concierge Lounge sometimes has snacks, and I grabbed a lot of Nutter Butters, and we were up visiting some Air Force folks around Boston, and I brought a lot of the Nutter Butters from the Marriott Lounge to the meeting. So we would have snacks. But since then,
that's a great story.
We were into Nutter Butters. Yeah, the Air Force, we did another DoD thing out in California, and there were Nutter Butters, and I had a nice stack of them. It's, hey, call sign Nutter Butters here again. I'm like, okay.
That's fantastic. So if you get called that again in a recording, then or a guest coming back, you'll know what's going on. Okay. All right. So side topic also, what is it about 90210 that resonates with you? Is there
Oh, Brandon said that. Okay, I got you. Now I know who this is. Yeah. No, it's just some of the people in Fed I've known a long, long time before they were in the Microsoft Federal organization, and they were in the state and local government organization. And one of them looks like a character from 90210. So whenever I see him, I ask him how Tori Spelling's doing. So
okay, all right, that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah.
They did not elaborate, so I appreciate you. I appreciate you diving into that.
No problem. Yeah.
So when it comes to some of that background, and you referenced 8 to 9 years, potentially 10 years up to the last 10 years or so working in Azure. What have you seen? Just even taking a further step back, the relationship between cloud technology, public sector, defense, and intel, and over the last 10 years, I mean, what have you seen change the most? And then what have you seen? Like what's old is new again, where some older principles are now enabled because of additional compute power, et cetera.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in the DoD and intelligence in the ability to deploy some technology that they can turn to 11 when they need to, right? And we saw that with CISA's announcement back in January around the Avanti VPN opportunity that they had. CISA just put out another alert today talking about the update. But there we saw, and there was an article on the Federal News Network where the Navy took their existing Azure Virtual Desktop deployment, which was nice, and they turned it to 11, as it were, like in Spinal Tap. They went and added up to, it said in the article, 110,000 users in a week from the 25,000 users that they had to turn on virtual desktop experience as a VPN alternative, right? So the way they've got it deployed, they're letting periodic users, reservists, others pop in. When they don't need it, they can turn it off, right? They can turn it down. And that's the big change is, 10 years ago, people were talking about the cloud like, oh, you can scale the way you want. People are doing it, right? And the Navy just friggin' did it. They turned on 6 digits worth of people in a week. That's what the article says. And I'll send you the link, but it's just crazy that the elastic alternatives that people have, they can do that, and they can do it with data. It's inevitable that I get on calls with customers where they say, oh, we got this project, but we're having trouble with storage on premises. I'm like, why are you doing it on premises? Well, our desktops are on premises. Well, okay. How about we put some desktops in the cloud? You can turn them on and off when you need, but we put your data in the cloud. Well, how do we get our data in the cloud? Well, let me talk to you about that. And so the ability to move data quickly or replicate data and data assets into our cloud service or report on them, it's super important. And the value of proximity is something that I think the DoD is seeing with these various desktop deployments. Yeah, the use case, you see, like we've got people on base who have a poor desktop experience because they're trying to get to assets over the Doden, and they're on a base. Maybe they have a T1. I don't even know what the connectivity from. It sounds like being on a base has the worst connectivity ever, right? Well, and they're trying to do their jobs. Well, if I can put a desktop next to the data and they're just getting a remote desktop experience, I've solved that proximity issue. And now all of a sudden there's almost no latency getting into the data, and the base can continue to have crappy connectivity. The user can work from home and get the same kind of desktop, and everybody in the DoD is taking advantage of the power of proximity for what we're doing from a data perspective, plus getting into the internet. I mean, the desktop services that I'm seeing in the DoD, if you fire up one of these Azure Virtual Desktop environments and you go to something like speed test from it, right? It's screaming fast. Yep. You get to see it's screaming. And even with those DoD, they may be flipping the connectivity down at the DISA-B cap, but it's still screaming, right? And totally different than desktop experience sitting on base, getting to the internet. Well, you bring up a couple good points. So, and I appreciate that backstory and perspective for those. So for those of you who are listening and need additional context, so these episodes that we do, they're complementing a speed dating series, and so in the coming months, if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to it yet, in the August 2024 timeframe, what we want to be able to do is not just demonstrate the capability of what he's talking about with Azure Virtual Desktop. So essentially, being able to solve the proximity issue that he just touched on, it's also there's always a
a caveat. Like even yesterday, we were having a conversation with somebody, and the experience that they had with one of the accelerators was limited in terms of the user experience. And so there's some configuration, John, that that is required, and that's where some of these conversations, when somebody hears it, they want to come back and they go, well, I heard this John Kelbley guy talk one time about AVD. What are some caveats, or what are some gotchas within the context of Doden or Doden customers where there could potentially be some pitfalls or some challenges? For instance, like data scientists, for instance, if they can't get access to their to their environments, how does somebody do that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So in the DoD, a lot of the Azure Virtual Desktop deployments that we're seeing are general purpose, like the Navy flank speed deployment or the Army deployment right now, where they're sharing, they're putting multiple users in a shared desktop experience without local admin rights. And these data science folks that we're dealing with, like Air Force, Air Force A9 types, or A4 geospatial, and some of these folks, they need local admin rights to install stuff, and they need access to cool tools and mountains of data. And the challenges they're running into is how to get the data out of IL5 towards the tools that are in Azure Commercial, because that's where the cool tools are, or vice versa, getting the cool tools up to the data, or any of that. And I think they're meeting in between with doing stuff in Azure Gov and trying to get some of those tools in there. But we've got a lot of data science and data analytics workloads across the DoD that folks are interested in. The big issue is local admin rights and proximity to data and data migration. Those are the things that we see. Whether data migration also between IL5 and IL6, right? But
that's a whole different set of challenges there.
Conversation. Let's not record that one. But moving the data around or getting access to the data is important. Wherever the data is, if it's in Azure or Azure connected, I can put a desktop next to it, and that solves a lot of problems for people. And the other thing is, when you're accessing that desktop, I can get you to access it with your CAC, right? Here's my CAC, right? And so I can put a desktop next to that data. It could even be on premises, and I can do it with AVD and securely access it. The benefit of using Azure Virtual Desktop with that is I can do it without a VPN. And because VPNs suck. They suck because they give you full access into the soft center of your environment through the crunchy exterior. Whereas AVD, not so much. You're just seeing a representation of a desktop. Exfil, you're still going to need your camera phone to do things, or you're going to shift print screen, and we can mitigate that. And that's what the DoD kind of likes about Azure Virtual Desktop is you can't take as much data out,
right?
If that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. I think the analogy makes a ton of sense for folks who aren't as maybe infra familiar, such as myself, for instance, or maybe even you, if you're listening, you're hearing some of these terms, whether it be acronyms or even just principles. But everybody can understand the idea of putting a desktop next in or close to the data. But then the added complexity of having different impact levels or different DISA accreditation components
or enclaves, even, right?
So that's where I wanted to. There was this image, or excuse me. There's this term that continues to get thrown around within the context of AVD, and I, not sure if I'm putting you on the spot here or not. But when it comes to custom images, what does that term mean? First of all, I guess generally speaking, and then how does that apply to that use case that we just described in terms of having a desktop close to the data?
Yeah, and when people start talking about custom images, that's because people want to manage and provide a consistent experience across multiple users.
Got it.
That's not what data scientists want.
No, I understand. Yeah.
They want to be able to install their own stuff. So they need local admin rights. They need to get different versions of this, that, and the other thing. But the DoD needs to manage that because you can't just pull code in from anywhere and pop it in. We just saw that with the recent exploits on Linux and SSL or whatever, or the terminal access. There was a lot of stuff last week on Twitter about that. So what Azure Virtual Desktop and VDI scenarios typically rely on is a base image for an operating system that ends up being deployed with a set of tools that are pre-configured and a bunch of settings. So DISA provides a set of security settings and guidance when you create, say, a Windows desktop or other desktops called STIGs. And those STIGs need to be implemented and enforced. And in a Windows environment, they're enforced using oftentimes something called group policy objects that are pushed down from Active Directory, kind of the Windows Central Directory. They're similar, although not as mature, tools for Linux where you can do some policy enforcement, and there's other ways to do policy enforcement. But the goal is to get a relatively ubiquitous, managed, secured operating system image that you can deploy to people to start as a base. And then add or update tools on it, do your patching on it, and then report back on all of that. And so a lot of these VDI deployments and Azure Virtual Desktop deployments, be it the Navy Nautilus, the Army solution, the Mantis Virtual Desktop from the Coast Guard or the Air Force Sonic Boom deployment, all of those VDI deployments or Azure Virtual Desktop deployments have those kind of characteristics. They have a base image, they lay software into it, they lay settings into it, and that image management process varies, quite honestly, between each one of them. They're all implementing to meet the exact same DISA security requirements, but they've really done them all completely differently, which is kind of cool to see because they're also doing them at scale. Like I said, the Navy's got 6 digits worth of enabled users. The Army's got an awful lot of users. Coast Guard, Air Force is spinning up a bunch of capacity. So that base image becomes important. The other thing is from a mission requirements perspective or data analytics perspective, can you get by with Windows? Do you want Windows? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. There are a lot of these data folks who just love their Linux tools. And I don't even know what most of them are, but like I loaded up one Linux box and there was like a squirrel sequel and all these cute little name things that were out there that people were trying to use. And I don't know what any of that stuff is, but I know it's there.
Yep.
And if you got a Linux box, you may need to install that stuff, keep it up to date. You need to be able to sudo, apt update.
And we made a joke here on the data team not too long ago about when you run into a challenge, you just sudo ask Brandon. So that's the not scalable.
Right. But it's an approach. Yeah. That's
not
right.
scalable, however, is what it is.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how we're touching on, the connectivity and even the configuration challenges associated with, with a tool like that. There's a use case where even something as practical as pulling data off of a government asset, and that government asset is mobile, flying around, so you can read between the lines on what kind of thing that is. Well, chain of custody becomes a really big deal there, and so whenever you have regressive analytics done against that type of program, you start going, okay, well, I have a specific preference in terms of what tools I'd like to use. And then to fit that use case, you have the tools that you're allowed to use in order to do that. So there's this kind of catch-22 of, I like how you described it. I haven't heard it said that way before, but you have your data in these secure environments, and then you have like your cooler commercial enabled options in terms of tools. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it seems like you can bridge the gap there a little bit easier with AVD. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's kind of what I'm generally hearing is available with some configuration caveats.
Right, and in the DoD, what's interesting is there are not data science projects, but there are projects where parts of the DoD need to provide internet access from NIPR. Right, you think, that sounds like. So what they've done is they've published onto NIPR an Azure Virtual Desktop Edge application running in Azure Commercial, an IL2 environment, but just published the user experience to it so they could get into low, but never compromise the high, right? Because they don't let the clipboard interact in it. And then they can blow away and recycle those VMs every night in the event that they're going to a website that gets compromised,
sure.
Right?
That
so
makes sense.
That's a really great security tool to get things in, and it keeps data or code from moving high, let's say, but gives them very, very low access, filthy internet access. So there's a lot of interesting scenarios out there for this kind of thing, and I'm working with some of those interesting data collection initiatives, like pulling things off planes kind of things. Right now, there's a cluster in the other room I'm configuring for somebody.
Very good.
lot going on.
So we had talked prior to recording the use case of sharing a desktop, and let's walk through. I think for those of you who are listening, this is not going to be that great of an experience for you. However, the video portion, I would challenge you. Go and find Data Talk on the video platforms, and go and find this particular episode, because what John's going to show, John, if what we could do is talk about that use case where you pulled up ABD, but then you also pulled up access to those particular Linux tools and kind of what a data scientist
VMs and stuff,
yeah,
right?
to doing data engineering, if you will, for connectivity, ingestion, etc. This is this use case where you can start to kind of crawl down that path. First would be, let's get you access to the tools that you want from a data science perspective.
Right. And so I'll just show you what the experience looks like with this Azure Virtual Desktop environment. And we do have, let me share my desktop, my screen.
Take your time.
I got to figure out how to do this. You guys have...
There's a share. There should
share
be a
screen.
share.
Yeah, there we go.
There you go.
Right. And so what ends up happening, for those of you who haven't used Azure Virtual Desktop, we've got this cool Azure Virtual Desktop client that a lot of the DoD and intelligence folks use to log into Azure Virtual Desktop. And there are literally, across all of Azure, millions of users taking advantage of this technology. And in the DoD, hundreds of thousands of people and intelligence. And it starts generally using this Windows client. Why do we use the Windows client rather than a web browser or anything else? Well, the answer is CAC. And being able to get that CAC reader to pass through into the session for authentication is very important. The Windows client supports it, the Mac client supports it. What ends up happening then is I need to subscribe to a workspace. Generally speaking, depending on what you're doing from an enclave perspective, you're going to log in with your CAC. I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to go to a DoD enabled website, but I'm just going to pop in to another different Azure Gov environment and show you that once I log in to the environment, and I'm this particular account I just disabled MFA on.
That's amazing that he knew that password that quickly. Wow, that's incredible.
I got a couple of passwords, and it's the muscle memory things change about.
Muscle memory. I like it.
Shit.
Yeah.
Of course, what's it doing? It's looping on me.
Of course.
Great demo. Thanks, John.
No, this is how it works. This is for those. Yeah, this is what it's supposed to do. This is what the user experience will be like. Right.
So now I'm popped in, and what typically you see for a DoD deployment is you're going to see desktops that are going to be presented to you, and they're going to be multi-user desktops. This is what the Air Force, Navy, Army, Coast Guard, and soon to be hopefully the Marines can pop into, and I can log into multiple different enclaves. Even some of the combat commands and things might have these set up. What I've got on my screen are a couple of icons that are here that are pointing to individual applications. And when we talk about data access, we could certainly pop into a Windows desktop. That's really cool, and get access to that. And I've already got one fired up here. And this is a multi-monitor experience. I'll just point this out. Why is it important that we have and we'll see down at the bottom of the screen, it's 3 monitors. I got three monitors on my computer.
Tracking.
The reason I point this out is because on my Windows desktop and my Windows VM in Azure, depending on how security is set up, I can move data very effectively in and out of the environment. So if it's a test dev environment, it's nice to note that the VM running in Azure, the desktop in Azure, has a local C drive and a D drive and a map to a high performance Azure NetApp file share where I keep all my Esri data for some geospatial work I'm doing with an agency. But the other thing that's important is up here, I have access to my local drives on my computer in Connecticut. So the stuff that I'm showing you on this computer, this VM is running down in Azure Gov Virginia, IL4, IL5 environment, and I've got security set up so I can move data back and forth. If I'm a data science type, that's really important. I may have data sets that I need to move between enclaves, and I may have rights to do that. Maybe I'm blocked from doing that, but that remote desktop protocol can be enabled to move data in and out. Now, from a security environment, you're probably going to be disabled for that. If you're doing data analytics with unclassified data, you might have the ability to move things around to get tooling, but we've got the flexible piece to do that. Of course, if I'm in the Azure environment, I can access data that's being collected there. So if I've got data collectors there, track servers, and I'm pushing stuff somewhere and I want to do analytics on it, I can take all that telemetry and work on it using those tools.
Can you connect to reporting tools like Power BI or something like that to those particular data sources?
Great question. So right here, I've got these icons that are published. Again, I'm sitting in Connecticut. I've got this client I logged into. Here's an icon for Power BI Desktop. This instance of Power BI Desktop is not running locally on my computer. It's running in Azure Government, right? So if there are data tools on my network in Azure Government that are only accessible in my Azure environment, this Power BI instance, Power BI Desktop, is going there, right? That's super powerful, right? Because I'm taking my tools and putting them by my mountain of data and I'm using it. And if I want to get the data out, I can't if I'm restricted. And this is where, if the data is already collected or being collected there, I can give people individual access. I had one federal agency, not DOD. This was their entire use case, was to get their Power BI developers access to one application that looked like it was running locally on their desktop, which is pretty slick, right?
That is very slick. It is very slick.
Right.
So for those of you who are listening, for those of you who are listening, I wish I could describe what he's seeing here, but think of the drop-down menu whenever you have a folder, a hierarchy, and you press the little button and it folds down. Essentially, we're on a desktop, but we're not. Right. We're on a desktop in a completely different geospace with application tools. I'm sorry, with analytics tools right next to the data, just like he's describing.
And I'll just point out, so this is a browser instance that I fired up from this client, right? So this is just an Edge browser, but it's running in Azure. Looks like it's local on my computer. I'm going to go to one of my favorite little websites called Speed Test, right? And like I'm living in Connecticut. It ain't modern times in Connecticut. If you all know about Connecticut, like we have oil tanks full of oil to heat our houses. We have septic tanks. Our wires are on poles over the house. I got a generator. My neighbor has llamas across the street. It's like Texas, but it ain't modern. So I'm at speedtest.net with a browser instance. My download speed is just shy of 1 gig a second. My upload speed is probably going to be twice that. I'm just guessing, might be less. But the important thing is, I don't have that kind of speed at my house, but I have it in Azure. So I can do all sorts of crazy work in Azure, regardless of what I've got going on in my house. Well, this is a little slow today. That's interesting. Normally, I'd see both of those over 1 gig. Must be a lot going on my VM. But that's kind of important, right? It's the power of proximity. The VM and the desktop session that I'm running are sitting on the freaking internet.
So when it comes to the use case that you just described, you had described Connecticut. Let's just say recruiting stations, right? I mean, we have 50 states all across this great country, a bunch of territories. Yeah. What would happen in an area like say Montana or North Dakota, and folks are trying to recruit there. They're trying to connect with high school students and that are interested in a lot of these tools, and they want to go and take these talent, skills, and abilities and go and apply them to their service. How could this particular technology enable a command like a recruiting command?
Well, it's funny because I did a pilot for the Marines, the recruiting command, a couple of years ago. We were down in Quantico. And the test that we did was, because I guess they give all the recruiters, and I wasn't hanging out with any of the recruiters, but the recruiting stations are kind of like in every strip mall, not the greatest places you want to go. They somehow they get the worst real estate ever. And I guess the recruiters, they give them an Android phone, and they don't give them much more from a computing perspective. So the test we were doing was, can we provide a full desktop experience off of Nipper to somebody with an Android phone? And we fired that up, and we had the Android phone was mirror casted up to a display. And we're sitting in a conference room in Quantico, full desktop experience, keyboard plugged in, boom. Crazy, right? On a device like that. So from that perspective, wow, we can provide full. Now, I think the Android phone would probably catch fire after too much work, like that.
Yeah, of course.
But who knows, right? But from a recruiting perspective, that's pretty powerful. The other thing that we've heard is from one of the other branches is they have a recruiting requirement where they need to like plug in crazy USB devices like signature capture cards, because it's not like when Bill Murray and Stripes signed up to go join the Army.
That's right.
Back in the day, right? You're not
or
signing paper.
We're bridging generational gaps here. Or Jarhead, whatever. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so So we're, they need to sign a pad. They need to get their thumb scanned and a reader. Those are crazy USB devices. So Azure Virtual Desktop allows you to, if you've got that device, capture all that and put it into a central database very easily. And I'll just point out, if you've ever looked at an RDP session before, they don't usually have this little icon here, the select devices for use. And what this is, I've enabled a capability called remote FX, advanced device redirection for USB. And all these devices here shouldn't be here. They're things that just shouldn't ever be redirected. The top one is the USB interface on my UPS at my house, and it's showing up on a VM in Azure Gov Virginia. Why is that important? Because we can support all those crazy USB devices like, signature capture. But if you're doing geospatial workloads or like engineering workloads, like we've got a lot of guys in the Navy doing crazy engineering, they use something called a 3D mouse to do a lot of what they do.
Right.
Those have to be registered specially and separately, and we can redirect all those crazy devices in Azure. So there's a lot of cool stuff we can do for recruiting and make things happen in Montana when all you've got is a shed, a light bulb, and your pet raccoon next to you.
That's exactly right. And my buddy Devin, who's listening, he was one of those who joined from Montana. He went on to be a Ranger. He's a great American, great guy. So I appreciate the detail that you go through. And
sure.
And the art of the possible is in a podcast like this, obviously we're in a controlled environment. We're walking through a scenario. So it's a little less dynamic than maybe in some of these other cases. Go ahead and stop sharing real quick, and then we'll go back. Unless you got something else you wanted to share.
Well, I was going to say, when we talk about data access, like we were talking about things like Linux and stuff like that, a lot of data scientists, and I was just pointing out, I mentioned to you this earlier, I got this crazy little icon for Ubuntu on my desktop, and that's a super sneaky trick that I did. I'll log out of it, but I logged into this. I might have had a CAC or MFA, and I can protect my enclave that way. I can double click on that Ubuntu icon and give a data scientist direct access into a Linux desktop where they can do whatever they want, load up the tools that they want, all these things. This is some of the meaningful, interesting work that we're doing with government agencies. Like we've got a scenario right now with the National Weather Service where they need to get a whole bunch of people into Linux desktops, but they've got to figure out where the capacity is and they can do it. And we had one of our CSAs write this magical thing to redirect people to Linux desktops in a thoughtful way using Microsoft's Windows, Azure Virtual Desktop technology. But we can get you into a lot of weird scenarios and some DoD ones using Linux and PuTTY and things that you would typically use to do weird development using Azure Virtual Desktop. And we've done it with DoD customers. So I'll stop sharing now.
That's great. It comes up not just, so I think the point that we're hovering over, and we'll just come right out and say it, is whenever you have app developers or you have backend database administrators who want to be able to do, extract, transform, and load data ingest engineering functions, AVD becomes almost a separate topic. However, it can be an enabler given the use case that you just ran through, where you have analytics tools close to the data on the same workstation, whether you're geographically close to it or not. Is that an accurate statement, or is that off base? Yeah,
it is. And I'd say that anytime you have an access issue or requirement, don't think of Azure Virtual Desktop as a desktop replacement. Think of it as an access alternative, right? So a VPN replacement. If, like, I've got an icon on my desktop right here for PuTTY, right? So I can double click PuTTY and have a PuTTY instance that looks like it's running on my local computer that's in my secure enclave, right? I have another PuTTY instance I didn't show you in the group below where it says AVD extra nutty stuff. That PuTTY instance is running on a VM on a cluster at my house. That's the one I use when I'm traveling and I need to get in my Raspberry Pis and fix them, right? So like the Raspberry Pi that tells me when my garage door opens and closes and stuff. So it's much better than a VPN. It's much better than providing NAT because I'm not opening a hole in my firewall. I've got an agent on a VM that's providing secure access that's all authenticated and authorized via my CAC.
That's pretty incredible. Yeah, from a credentialed standpoint, that it scratches a lot of itches that a lot of folks would probably have, having listened to some of these topics prior to explaining the context that you shared. I think if we so we're about ready to wrap. We got a jam here. What if we were going to land this plane, and if there's what I would call saved rounds, any saved rounds, given some of the context that you've shared for the relationship between the cool commercial available tools, access to the data, and bridging the gap between these two, what would you leave these folks with?
That this Azure Virtual Desktop, if you're running into any access issues, Azure Virtual Desktops, I think of it as a security tool and a secure access tool, right? So you got a mountain of data somewhere. You're like Scrooge McDuck with a pile of money somewhere you're going to swim through. Put AVD, VM right next to it, secure with a CAC, and you can get into it. And what I didn't talk about was like the cluster I'm configuring back here. We can provide desktop access around the world. So let's say you've got in Guam a bunch of data collection you're doing. We can put an Azure Stack HCI cluster there, and this is happening right now. Places
tracking. Yep.
Put a desktop there connected to a gateway broker infrastructure in Azure that's CAC enabled, and you can get fast desktop access right next to the data forward deployed. Right, that's where it gets really crazy. Repair locations, engineering locations that normally wouldn't have data in Azure for either security or other reasons. As long as it's internet accessible or Doden accessible, we can get you a good desktop into it and do it in the pretty, not a crazy complicated way. And the DoD's doing it now, so there's precedent.
Very good, very good. And well, John, I appreciate you. I feel like I should call you call sign Nutter Butter, but we'll just call you John. So we'll do John.
You're making me hungry. All I got's a granola bar here. So
there you go. All right. Well, I mean, maybe get up and grab one. That to chase down the Mountain Dew. You know, you never know. That's it. That's how you get it through. That's how you get through the day here at Microsoft. So John, I appreciate you blocking time. I appreciate you rounding out some of that narrative with with the use case of talking about the art of the possible, talking about accessibility and how it's a secure access tool and how it can complement the missions that are out there. So we appreciate you blocking time for us today.
Yep.
Thank you for that final thought. For those of you who like listening, make sure that you're subscribed, leave a review, try to take it easy on the 90210 references and Nutter Butter in the reviews too. Because John,
I'm not in a calorie deficit because of the Nutter Butters. I'll just say that. Yeah.
There you go. All right. Well, I appreciate y'all. With that, we're a wrap, and we'll talk to you next time. See you guys. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Federal Data Talk. Hopefully you've gained valuable insights and inspiration to fuel your journey into the world of data. Join us for new episodes, but don't forget to like and subscribe. That way you don't miss it whenever we release them, for thought-provoking discussions and interviews with industry experts. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.